This is the 11th episode in the Design Education series. I actually have a list of 135 episodes on the topic, but by publishing a series, I am producing a small research project. You can hear the difference between them. I ask everybody, or almost everybody, the question, what's missing in design education today? And each one responds from their perspective. There are people teaching or coming from Italy, Argentina, Guatemala, USA, Dubai, Colombia, Cuba, Brazil, Spain, Netherlands, Chile, and the United Kingdom. There are many countries because this series has 15 episodes. Peter Lloyd is a professor in Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He teaches and researches design theory and methodology. Recent work has focused on how designers and AI can work in dialogue with one another. He has been part of the UK Policy Lab. In this interview, we talked about design as dialogue, AI, design in the context of policymaking, and design activism podcasting. My name is Mariana Salgado. This is Diseño y Diáspora.
Well, I'm Peter Lloyd. I am a professor in design methodology, one of the few, I guess, in the world. And design methodology is really the study of the practices and procedures of designing. So it's not about creating new design methods. It's really looking at how people do design, the kinds of methods and techniques and tools they use to design. And really looking at how those affect the process of design. So the design process has been my kind of central interest through my academic career, both in...
And what did you study?
I started off studying engineering a long time ago, electronic engineering. This is back in the 80s. And I worked as an engineering designer for a while, and sort of got interested in the process of design that I was following, working with clients, designing big machines, and I decided I wanted to go back and do a PhD looking at the creative process. So I started a PhD in cognitive psychology, so looking at literally the thought processes of creative people, of designers, and how they work. And I would try to model that using an AI program language called Prolog at the time. This was 1988 or something like that. I've had a long-standing interest in AI too. And from that, I went on to look at design as it's practiced in organizations. So spent some time sort of doing more ethnographic type work, just sitting in the corner of an organization, watching how people communicate, watching how ideas emerge. And I think from there, I began to get much more of an interest in the language that people use when they do designing. So, how words relate to things, basically, and how those, when you're designing, you're sort of talking about something as if it exists, but it doesn't yet exist. It's sort of like you're bringing something into existence that's very fluid. I like that thought about designing is sort of bringing something into existence, but it doesn't happen all at once. It has to happen over a period of time.
But if you talk about the vocabulary or the way we talk, it also depends a lot on the context, no? Because if you are the only designer in an organization, it's completely different than if you have a team of designers.
Absolutely,
and then you can use our slang. And
I think it's all about context, which is why sometimes design methods kind of don't work as well as people think they do, because they have a very kind of general view of what designing is. And then people say, well, yeah, but this doesn't work because this happened and that happened. And that's all contextual. And it is very, very much about where you are, who's in the room with you, who you're communicating with, what type of things you're talking about. So yeah, it's very, very contextual and local. That's what I've come to kind of like appreciate about designing. It's for every design is a kind of unique possibility to kind of create the future, I think.
So how do you teach then about methodologies? Which one is the real one or the meaningful one in a certain context?
That's always what the students want to learn. You know, which is the best method? What should I use? You know, how can I best design?
This is a more common question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it applies to a lot of different professions. You know, if you look at lawyers or people that dance or artists, or they all have methods, they all have processes, and to some degree, they're all taught in a similar way. You need an appreciation of the best work in your field and how that work was produced. You need an idea of the kind of the methods and the theories that help you produce that work. And you need a sort of understanding of history, I think, the history of how people have done things in the past and how new technologies have come along that enable new things to happen. And, you know, we're at this moment, you know, with AI kind of breaking on us, that we have this new technology that we can use in designing. And I think, you know, that's the current puzzle, is how can we take this technology and make it work for us in creative processes.
So which kind of exercise do you do with your students in order to have a good discussions on AI?
I teach a course called Designing Intelligence, which is about what is intelligence? Is it something in your head? Is it something in interactions? Is it something that a computer can exhibit? So we start from that point of view. What kind of thing, what kind of material are we talking about? And we have lots of little exercises that try and sort of explore the interactions between those different intelligences. I think from teaching AI and design, it's much more about sort of workflows now, and in a sense, a kind of crafting process. Because AI, it's sort of, because it responds so quickly, you know, generate an image comes straight back. Whereas you don't have to work at your images, you don't have to work at your kind of narratives, you can just generate them instantly. And I think that's made the design process a little bit more non-linear in a way. So I think there's
also more connected to vocabulary, right? Because depending on the words you enter, the result you get.
Yeah, I think that connected very well with my research, because I was very interested in certain words and how words are used to frame problems, and, you know, how certain phrases, you know, really capture a kind of solution. And obviously language models based on kind of words, those kinds of words is an ideal medium to kind of explore that kind of designing. I have a lot of conversations with students and with other researchers about language, and they say, yeah, but, you know, design's a visual process. You know, it's about producing prototypes and objects and images, and it's not about language. And I think the large language models have shown us how much language is involved in our thinking and how much it's central to our intelligence and the way we understand the world around us. So I think it's sort of like brought language much higher up the into our consideration.
But do you think that would make us designers more capable to argument on our designs? Like not only design, but also to kind of discuss what we are doing.
Yeah. I think that's the benefit of AI, is it gives you so much material to work with and so many different types of, you know, narrative and information and, as you say, arguments. And I think it's working out. That's part of working out how to deal with AI and creative processes, is when to stop, what's enough material to work with. You can go on and on and on generating new material, but in the end, you have to understand, well, what am I trying to do with this material? You know, there is a kind of still a a human judgment that's required about the process. What's the material doing for the process that I want to conduct? I'm not sure some of the master student projects that I supervise that are based in organizations. Organizations are very interested now in how AI can augment their design processes, their various aspects of the business. They don't really know how to go about this. So the students are really at the forefront of exploring these new techniques, even further than the teachers in the faculty. So the students are kind of really leading on this sort of expertise now, which I think is an interesting situation now, because we're learning as much from the students as we're able to teach. We have obviously this historical knowledge of designing and where designers come from and the sort of traditional design methods and tools. But with such a revolutionary technology of AI, it's difficult to keep up. And the students, because they're developing these new workflows that are much different from existing workflows.
But that could be super healthy for design education as a whole, because then we have a little bit more of less hierarchies, right?
Yeah. It is. It's disrupting many things, and I think in a way that's what AI makes you do. It's reevaluate what's valuable about the knowledge that we have, and who has that knowledge, and who's qualified to teach to instruct. So I think for a long time I've been very much a fan of sort of constructing structures for education where everyone learns something. So the teachers, the students, the coaches that are coaching the students, and I think creating those structures is, in a way, it's a kind of educational design process. But there has to be a kind of enough variability and possibility in these educational structures that allow people to explore in different directions.
For example, you work exploring a lot with podcasts, I understood, right? I interviewed some of your students that they told me.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was, I think I start from a theoretical point of view. My view of designing is a kind of dialogue that takes place. It's about how people tell stories to each other, how people construct stories of the future, how they reimagine the past, all these sorts of things. So again, a kind of linguistic kind of process. And I think maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when I was trying to come up with a new course, I thought the podcast form, the way that people just have discussions with each other, is an ideal form to illustrate the fact that you develop ideas through discussion. So yeah, I produced a series of podcasts on various aspects of design methods and design methodology, talking to sort of experts in different areas. And not too long, just kind of short enough to keep the students interested, because, I don't know, young people tend to play podcasts at 1.5 speed or twice the speed, or, they like to see.
How long were your podcasts?
They were about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we had a discussion after each podcast. And I think that's always important. When I listen to podcasts, I always like it when someone's interviewed, and then either the person that's interviewing or the people that are interviewing then have a discussion about that interview. So it sort of adds a bit more depth to what's been said.
So you want us, we can do that. So
yeah,
we have this discussion, and then at the end we have a discussion of how it went, the interview. I like it.
And you can be as critical as you want. I think, quite often that's when, for students, I think that's when some learning kind of happens. It's sort of like when you point out a specific thing and say, but this is an example of this, and I really liked it.
But the students were part of your podcast. So who was debating on the content of the interview?
No, the students weren't part of the podcast. No, they were. We were interviewing academics, and then we were talking. The course designers, myself and Mika van der Bel, were having conversations afterwards, and then we basically asked students to listen to those podcasts and then ask questions about those podcasts. So they were basically the starting points for learning activities. But the other thing is, you can listen to podcasts anyway. You can go along riding your bike, walk in the park. So it's sort of like I kind of like the fact that they you don't have to be sat at a desk reading something. You can just.
But it's not only that we like the fact, but it's also proven that for our brain, it's better to be not in front of a screen, but to be moving, so that you think differently. And this is why a lot of our ideas come while in the shower, going to the toilet, or I don't know, like running.
Yeah, I like. A lot of design methodologists embrace this idea of chance. Chance. You create structures that then chance things happen, and it always seems like, if I hadn't been here and doing this thing, then this thing wouldn't have worked. But those things happen quite regularly in designing. That chance provides you with a sort of a kind of answer to things. And when you're walking along and you're thinking about a design problem and you listen to a podcast and then you see something, you think, that's the thing that I need, and it seems like magic, but it's not. That's just how we are as humans. It's a lot of work. We had a lot of work editing, and I did think of carrying on interviewing with different people, and I think it was just I didn't have the time to carry on, basically. But I would have done. I think also you need the sort of expertise around you to help you produce podcasts too. Music, and you have to have a level of quality, I think. Otherwise, people just don't listen. That was one thing that I'd never compromised on audio quality, because it's nice to hear people's voices, and not have distortion and sort of like lots of distraction.
But when you talk about education structures, one of them, it was the setting the stage for doing podcast for you, because it just came to my mind to ask you about the podcast when you were talking about structures for education.
Yeah.
But maybe I was kind of pushing that.
I think I was. Yeah, I think I kind of looked for a kind of framing device in education. So this idea of design as a kind of dialogue, and then I look for things that actually reinforce that idea. So podcasts were a way of showing that you can have two people that with two different views, and neither of them are right. So to try and find out something in a creative process that's absolutely objectively true. It doesn't exist. You have to kind of construct an argument, construct a conversation. Sometimes some people seem to convince you. Sometimes it's other people. So you have to take a position yourself as a student. You have to say, well, I think I like the points that this person is making, or I like the points that this person is making. So you're constructing your knowledge about the design process in this instance. So other exercises and structures within the course also reinforce that idea that discussion is how you understand things. It's not a lecturer or a professor like me standing at the front of the class saying, this is this and this is this, and use this method and use that. It's not a kind of me transmitting my knowledge to everyone. It's like we build this knowledge together, and that's what designing is too.
Well, and the orality has something on the accessibility, because we speak clearer than when we write.
Yes.
Or we can write on more complex things. So of course, writing helps to think about complex issues, but when we have to explain it, we do it automatically in an easier or more clearer way.
Yeah, so a lot of my research involves transcribing conversations and thinking about what people are saying to each other. And the more you look at how people talk to each other, the stranger and stranger it gets. Because we think, this is normal to have a conversation. I say something, you say something, But when you look at the words people use, and the ums and the ahs and the words that don't really matter at all, you think, why are we talking like this? What are we really talking about? So it's when you get down to it, it's quite philosophical. Is what are we trying to communicate about? And it's not really about the words, because we don't talk in grammatical sentences. We talk with our body, in body language. We talk with our eyes. We talk with our mouths.
With the intentions of the voice, like how do you set the
and
voice.
there's all kinds of expressions and ways of saying things and emphasizing things, and also word choice. Which words do we choose to talk about certain things? And there's a lot of theory to say, certain people use certain words in certain ways. We can explore things like that in design processes too.
This interview is part of the lists D&D in English, Educación en Diseño, Holanda y Diseño, Investigación en Diseño, Diseño y Gobierno, Diseño y Políticas Públicas, Inteligencia Artificial y Activismo y Diseño. If those list names are in Spanish, still you can find some episodes in English and Portuguese too. During the whole interview, Peter poses questions, many good questions. I love it because some of them remained with me. He asked, how do we design? What is the language we use while doing design? Which methods are beneficial to which content? How do you construct dialogue? How do you do it in an effective way in the context of a design process? Considering that he thinks that design as dialogue, this way of asking and asking is fantastic. Hope you're inspired not only by the assertions of this dialogue, but also by the way of asking questions. This way of asking question and questioning can be as revealing as the content in itself. Let's continue listening to Peter, that he has much more to tell us. Okay, now let's change a little bit the topic because I have prepared a lot of questions and I ask any of them. So you recently wrote an article about how a program on politics, philosophy and economics in Oxford has been influential in the education of many of prime ministers in the UK. So your argument is that this program was not addressing problem solving, but these future shaping people, like the prime ministers, would have needed it. So you even propose a studio space in the syllabus of the program. What's the aim of this type of articles?
Well, I think for a long time I've been interested in where design can be most effective, and I think that designing products, cars, furniture, environments that's fine, but I think perhaps the biggest impact that design can have is in policy, governmental policy, particularly in how we changed the law, because politics is about a view of the future, if it's about anything, and how we envision that future, how we move towards that future with legislation, again through discussion and argument and debate, I think is about designing.
But there is very few of these policy labs or in which there is involved design. Have you been involved in working with policy design?
Yeah, I was part of the UK Policy Lab. I was a sort of an advisor on a project there looking at how methods of design were being integrated into the UK government. This was in 2014, I think, 2016, something around then. And it's very interesting. Politics is generally done through text. People write things down. If you look at the law, it's written down in clauses and, in a very formal language. And design is playful, it's fluid, it's about artifacts and prototypes and trying to integrate those two things. So you have administrators and civil servants with their papers and their clauses and then you have designers with their, interesting ideas and sort of just exploring all kinds of areas, trying to integrate those two approaches is that was the purpose of the policy lab. And I think they had some success in trying to get across new approaches. But I think when you look at the sort of history of design thinking, trying to bring design methods into organizations, you always have that kind of culture clash of, well, these seem like interesting people, they're coming up with some good ideas, but really we don't really do things like that. We have to work in the ways that we always work. And I think that's the real issue, is that if you bring designers into a new situation, there's always some kind of clash somehow, not always. And I think the point of the blog post was, well, why don't we teach people to at least understand design as part of their other educational program? So if you're studying economics, for example, that's very close to designing. Lots of economists have very good connections with the design discipline. And if we can bring more design into those kinds of courses, we just get people with better imaginations. In the end, I think, able to think about the future in slightly more nuanced ways, also with their own disciplines. So this, the PPE, the Politics, Philosophy, Economics course at Oxford, which has been so influential, that was the sort of like the prime example of, if we could only bring a bit of design in here, how would the world be different? Would we avoid all these problems? Probably not, but I think it would be, giving people some permission to be creative would certainly help.
And the UK Policy Lab, you were also training non-designers to learn design methodologies?
It was more bringing people with design expertise into kind of into government. So it wasn't so much about training other people, although that's a consequence of bringing designers in and working together with designers, is people have more of appreciation of what designing can do. But it was more to bring design expertise into government to try and think about new policies, policy formulation, think from a more human-centered perspective, participation. Those kinds of methods were kind of brought in.
Well, what I have seen and I see still is that there are a lot of designers in the government, but mainly involved in the implementations of laws, but not so much in the creation of new laws.
Exactly. Yeah, designers tend to be the end of the line. We've got this policy, we need to make it look nice, either on the website through interaction or the user experience, or at the beginning of the process where we're thinking, what should we do for this policy? You never see designers. That's a kind of political discussion a lot of the time. So I think it's wishful thinking to think, well, just get a designer in to help you. What we need to do is to bring design into education in non-design disciplines. I think that's where I think we could be most effective.
Interesting. Another of your topics, the ones that you have been researching lately, is how design have served to acts of disobedience. Were you involved in teaching design methods to people from other disciplines?
Yeah. Like design activism, you mean? And I think for me, understanding how you bring other people into the design process is sort of key to effective designing. How you construct the dialogue that you have, or the conversation that you have with those other people in design processes, either in a collaborative, participative way, but also in a sort of confrontational way. And that's why I'm sort of interested in design activism, as in, if you really feel passionately about something, and I think, again, this is kind of a lot of politics, or you really want to protest something, that can be a creative act as well. You can design a kind of confrontational strategy in order to have that kind of conversation. Yeah, there was one of my blog posts talks about an exhibition that was called Disobedient Objects, objects for protest, basically, and for pushing back against authority, against institutions, and I think that's always interesting for students to think that, design is not just about commercial success and shiny new objects. It's about how you have a conversation with, a set of people. So I always use that as an example in my teaching for participative design. How do you listen to other people? How do you understand other viewpoints? And how do you kind of represent your own viewpoints to people that don't necessarily agree with you?
So what do you recommend us to read on these topics? To read or listen or to see, because I know that you are a very active podcast listener, right?
I am.
Also.
Yeah, I love podcasts. I've been through a lot of podcasts. I like podcasts that reflect on the creative process. So there's a podcast called Song Exploder that I like, which is sort of goes back to particular popular songs or rock songs, and then sort of looks at how they were created. And again, I think that's interesting from a process point of view. Is there are a lot of kind of random things that happen, chance things that happen, and technologies that are involved, and someone taking you through that process is really insightful, I think. Then I like the design podcast that I like, 99% Invisible. You're probably well aware of that. I mean, when I first came across that, it was almost what I was trying to do with my blog, is to kind of go back through history and tell a story about how something comes about. That's kind of design. When you take that approach, you sort of see design is everywhere. It's in the products, it's in the environments, but it's in the things that you don't normally think of as design. Everything that we've created as humans has a story associated with it. And I think some of the episodes there have been amazing in their detail and the sort of history of how things are as they are. To understand why the world is as it is, I think is a great topic for a podcast. So
you also make one blog on you make a review of one of the episodes of 99% Invisible, and you talk about that sometimes it's better for a designer to do nothing. And then you finalize that blog. I love it when you say that a designer wanted to do nothing has a lot of work on their hand. So could you tell us about that?
That's right. I mean, to some degree, you always think, well, if you've got a designer involved, you're always going to get something at the end of it all. But I think if you look at any problem, one of the things is not to make things worse, or not to make things, kind of overly determined for other people. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult for people to say, actually, we don't need any new design here. We just need to step away and let things play out. Or, our instinct is always to try to improve and to make better.
By doing, by making, by intervening. Yeah. Because sometimes we can make it better by arguing for something that is right as it is.
Yeah. And I think that plays out. I think in the post, it's about sort of immigration from Mexico to the US, and how at one stage there was a pretty open border, and there was a sort of annual migration cycle where people would come in for work and then they would go back so the border was porous. And at some stage, once you decide to sort of close down the border, then that creates all kinds of other kind of problems that you hadn't anticipated. And of course, they're political decisions. It's political decisions now on the contemporary world. But actually, it's a nice thought experiment to think, well, if we had done nothing at that point, where would we be now, kind of thing. I think it's perfectly valid to have a big design process, a big process of analysis, and then to conclude, actually, we don't need to do anything. That would be a brave designer that came up with that conclusion. Actually, I think one of the, I did write a post that reminds me of the Charles and Ray Eames and the India report. So Prime Minister Nehru in India commissioned Charles and Ray Eames to do a report about design education in India. And they traveled all around India. They spent a year, I think, going everywhere in India, looking at the artifacts, talking to the people, going to the universities. And they were commissioned to write this report. And they wrote this report you can get it online. It's really interesting to read because it's a very odd format. It's a long, thin document, and it's only about 30 pages long. And apparently it caused outrage in the government because they were expecting, like a 3,000 word report or something. And it's just this model of elegance, really for saying, well, you don't really need to do too much. But if you did this, then this would have a big impact, So I think that's a good illustration of that kind of thing.
So they did not propose something new.
They proposed a set of exercises. I think it was a design school that had three different exercises. It was very much based on kind of understanding systems. So it was, they looked at the Indian postal system, I think, and they looked at kind of the traditional making processes, and they structured those into exercises. And I think it's a really interesting document to read. I'd really recommend it.
Perfect. And where is your practice going?
I think I still have this interest in language, because I think, as we were talking about earlier, I think large language models have brought kind of language back into view. And for a long time, my research was about transcribing what people say, spending a lot of time transcribing those, making transcripts and making analysis. And now you can do that again. AI can transcribe things for you, in 10 seconds, and you get these amazing.
And it can also analyze it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we have these analytical tools now, but we can really analyze big data sets. So my task now is really trying to kind of pull together big sets of data related to design activity and really try and find some kind of pattern in word usage. So even if that's a fairly simple outcome in the end, if I can establish that designers use this word more than other people, that would be enough for me, based on big sets of data and big analysis. So I think that's where I'm currently focused on, is doing bigger data, using bigger data, and using analytical techniques that use machine learning and AI in order to kind of get this insight into design as a profession, as an activity, as a procedure.
Okay. So what would you recommend to the young Peter that just finishes his studies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, keep an open mind, and follow your interests. I've always followed things that I found interesting wherever they have led me. Sometimes they lead you down dead ends. Sometimes you go in a completely other discipline, and you don't see the connections necessarily. So, for me, everything was about keeping an open mind, and don't plan too much. Things evolve, things happen. Interesting things happen. So I would say, just don't worry so much. You'll have an interesting life.
Thank you a lot for the interview.
Thank you too, Mariana.
Peter mentioned that a big part of his research involves transcribing conversations. That got me thinking about what I do with this podcast. It's not so much about transcribing, but more about reviewing and reflecting. Here's my process. I go through my notes, pick out things that resonate with me, and use what I've heard to reflect on my own work. Sometimes I just repeat something I found particularly useful. I'm always thinking about what to highlight from each interview. I know most people are multitasking while listening to podcasts, so repeating and emphasizing key points can be really helpful for some of you, hopefully. Plus, we all listen differently, right? So my focus might draw listeners' attention to something they might have missed. Whether it's transcribing conversations, reviewing them, or commenting them, all of these are part of the practice of really listening to others. That's why I'm trying to train myself to do through this podcast work. For me, listening is about opening up to other perspectives, another way of learning from each other in the field of design. As always, the music of this podcast is by Antonio Zimmerman. Sound design is by Andy Fecci. This podcast is published with Creative Commons license with attributions. This was Diseño y Diáspora. You can follow us on our social media channels in YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter, or visit our website. Remember to recommend us and recommend our books. By the way, did you notice that we published our second book on health and design? All our publications are online and free from our website. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.